Marcus Chen had always known he was different from his classmates at the Galactic Academy. While the other species floated, slithered, or phased through the corridors with elegant grace, he walked with heavy footsteps that echoed through the pristine halls. His human physiology stood out like a sore thumb among the delicate crystalline beings, the gossamer-winged ethereals, and the luminescent aquarians who seemed to dance rather than move. The Academy was a marvel of engineering, suspended in the void between three star systems. Its translucent walls offered breathtaking views of nebulae and distant worlds, while gravity generators created different atmospheric zones for the diverse student body. Marcus had been one of only 12 humans selected from Earth to attend this prestigious institution, part of humanity's first exchange program since joining the Galactic Federation 3 years ago. On this particular morning, Marcus shuffled into advanced theoretical physics, his heavy boots making soft thuds against the cushioned floor designed for more delicate species. The classroom was a sphere of pure energy, with floating platforms that adjusted to each student's preferred learning environment. Marcus's platform was reinforced durasteel, painted to look like the others but noticeably more robust. Professor Veltar glided into the room on 6 gossamer wings, his crystalline body refracting the ambient light into rainbow patterns. The ethereal was renowned throughout the galaxy for his brilliant mind and his research into quantum consciousness. He was also known for his particular disdain for what he called primitive species. Today we will be exploring the delicate art of psionic energy manipulation, Professor Veltar announced, his voice chiming like wind through crystal caves. This requires a refined consciousness, an evolved mental state that allows one to touch the very fabric of reality itself. The other students began their exercises with fluid grace. The Aquarians' bodies pulsed with bioluminescent patterns as they channeled energy through their neural networks. The crystalline Zephyrite resonated at frequencies that made the air itself shimmer. Even the young Vorthon, barely past their metamorphosis stage, managed to create small fields of twisted space-time. Marcus closed his eyes and tried to feel for the energy that supposedly flowed through all living things. He had read the textbooks, studied the diagrams, practiced the meditation techniques. Yet nothing happened. No mystical forces bent to his will. No cosmic awareness expanded his consciousness. He was just Marcus, sitting on a floating platform, trying not to feel like an imposter. "Mr. Chen," Professor Veltar's voice cut through the peaceful atmosphere like a shard of ice. "Perhaps you would demonstrate your understanding of psionic energy manipulation?" Marcus opened his eyes to find 37 pairs of alien eyes focused on him. Some glowed, others shifted through spectrums beyond human perception, but all carried the same expression of polite curiosity mixed with barely concealed doubt. "I'm still working on the basics, Professor," Marcus replied honestly. "The meditation techniques are challenging for human neurology." Professor Veltar's crystalline features shifted into what Marcus had learned was the ethereal equivalent of a condescending smile. "Ah, yes, the limitations of primitive neural architecture. Perhaps you could enlighten us about these challenges?" The way he said primitive made Marcus's jaw tighten. It wasn't the first time he'd heard that word applied to humanity, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. In the 3 months since arriving at the Academy, Marcus had endured countless subtle and not-so-subtle reminders that Earth was considered a backwater world inhabited by a crude species barely worthy of Federation membership. "Human brains evolved for survival in a hostile environment," Marcus said carefully, trying to keep the irritation out of his voice. "We're hardwired for pattern recognition, threat assessment, and rapid decision-making under stress. The meditative states required for psionic manipulation don't come naturally to us." "Indeed," Professor Veltar said, floating closer to Marcus's platform. Your species developed on what the Federation classifies as a class through the Deathworld. Constant warfare, predation, natural disasters, and resource competition. It's no wonder your neural pathways are too crude for the subtle arts. Several students made sounds that Marcus had learned were expressions of sympathy or amusement, depending on the species. He felt heat rising in his cheeks, but forced himself to remain calm. Getting angry would only prove their point about human primitiveness. However, the professor continued, I believe we should demonstrate the proper technique. Perhaps a direct neural interface would help you understand what you're missing. Before Marcus could object, Professor Veltar extended one delicate crystalline appendage toward Marcus's forehead. This may be somewhat uncomfortable for your primitive nervous system, but education often requires sacrifice. The moment the professor's finger touched Marcus's skin, pain exploded through his skull. It wasn't just physical pain, though, that was intense enough. It was the sensation of having his mind forcibly invaded, his thoughts rifled through like files in a cabinet. Professor Veltar was demonstrating psionic abilities by showing Marcus exactly how inferior human mental defenses were. Marcus saw flashes of his own memories being examined and dismissed, his childhood in the Detroit ruins, his father's stories about the resource wars, his mother's death during the water riots. Each memory was touched with casual cruelty, judged and found wanting by an alien intelligence that viewed human experience as something between curiosity and disgust. You see, Professor Veltar said, his voice echoing inside Marcus's head while his classmates watched. Human consciousness is so dense, so weighted down by survival instincts and emotional baggage, like trying to perform surgery with a sledgehammer. The violation continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Professor Veltar probed deeper, examining Marcus's fears, his doubts about belonging at the academy, his anger at being constantly underestimated. Each thought was laid bare and mocked. Fascinating, the professor mused aloud. Even your emotional responses are crude. Notice how the anger centers of his brain are so overdeveloped compared to the higher reasoning functions. Truly primitive. That was when something snapped in Marcus's mind. Not broke, exactly, but shifted, like a gear clicking into a different configuration. The pain was still there, the violation was still happening, but suddenly Marcus could feel something else, something that had been there all along, waiting. It wasn't the refined, elegant psionic energy that the other species used. This was something altogether different, something raw and primal and utterly human. It was the same force that had driven his ancestors to hunt mammoth with sharpened sticks, to cross oceans in wooden boats, to stand up to tyrants with nothing but determination and rage. Professor Veltar was still rifling through Marcus's memories when he hit something unexpected. A wall. No, not a wall, a trap. Marcus's survival instincts, those same primitive reflexes that the professor had been mocking, had been learning, adapting, waiting for the exact moment when the invader was most vulnerable. What? Professor Veltar began, but his words cut off as Marcus's mind suddenly reversed the neural link. Where the professor had expected to find crude human consciousness, he instead found something that made his crystalline form shudder in shock. This wasn't the elegant, refined, psionic energy he was used to. This was the mental equivalent of a star-going supernova. Raw, unfiltered, absolutely devastating human willpower focused into a single point and driven by 3 months of accumulated frustration. Marcus didn't know how he was doing it, couldn't have explained the mechanism if his life depended on it. All he knew was that Professor Veltar had violated his mind, mocked his species, and demonstrated exactly why humanity was considered inferior. And now, for just a moment, the tables were turned. The professor tried to withdraw from the neural link, but found himself trapped by the sheer overwhelming force of human determination. Marcus's mind was like being caught in a gravitational well. The harder you tried to escape, the deeper you sank. Through the connection, Marcus could feel the professor's shock and growing fear. The delicate ethereal consciousness, evolved in peaceful gardens under gentle suns, had never encountered anything like the barely controlled fury of a human who had been pushed too far. Marcus felt something shift in the cosmic balance as his classmates gasped in various alien languages. Several of the more sensitive species actually fled the room as the psychic backlash washed over them in waves. The Academy's monitoring systems began chiming warnings as energy readings spiked beyond their sensors' ability to measure. Professor Veltar's crystalline body began to crack under the strain, hairline fractures appearing as his refined consciousness was overwhelmed by the raw, undisciplined power of human emotion. His 6 wings fluttered frantically as he finally managed to break the connection, but the damage was done. The professor collapsed onto his hovering platform. His usual brilliant luminescence dimmed to a faint flicker. Around the room, the remaining students stared in shock at Marcus, who sat perfectly still on his reinforced platform, looking exactly as he had before, except for his eyes, which now held a glint of something that made even the bravest aliens look away. In the silence that followed, Marcus finally understood why his species came from a death world. It wasn't just about the hostile environment or the constant threats. It was about the kind of mind that such a world forged, a mind that could endure anything, adapt to everything, and when pushed beyond its limits, push back with interest. The Academy would never look at humanity the same way again. The Academy's medical bay was a marvel of interspecies healthcare technology, with specialized units for every known form of consciousness in the galaxy. Professor Veltar occupied the crystalline regeneration chamber, his fractured form slowly healing under precisely calibrated energy fields. The medical staff, a team of amphibious healers whose touch could mend both flesh and spirit, worked frantically to repair the damage to his psyche. Marcus stood outside the medical bay, flanked by 2 security wardens whose imposing mechanical forms clicked and whirred with each movement. He had been waiting for 3 hours, watching through the transparent walls as teams of specialists worked to undo what he had accidentally unleashed. The guilt was eating at him, but underneath it was something else. A growing awareness that everything he thought he knew about himself was wrong. "Student Chen," a melodious voice called from behind him. Marcus turned to see Dean Vothari approaching, her serpentine lower body undulating gracefully across the floor. The Naga was ancient by galactic standards, her scales bearing the deep blue-green of wisdom, and her eyes holding depths that seemed to contain entire star systems. "Dean Vothari," Marcus said, trying to keep his voice steady, "I need to apologize. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. Professor Veltar was just trying to help me understand, and I was defending yourself," the dean interrupted, her voice carrying harmonics that somehow conveyed both authority and compassion. "Walk with me, Marcus. We have much to discuss." They moved through corridors that Marcus had grown to love despite everything. The Academy was beautiful in ways that Earth architecture couldn't match. Walls that shifted color based on the emotional state of those passing through. Gravity wells that allowed students to walk on ceilings when they needed a different perspective, and windows that could display any view in the known galaxy. "Tell me about your homeworld," Dean Vothari said as they walked. "Not the official Federation reports. Tell me what it was really like to grow up there." Marcus was quiet for a moment, organizing his thoughts. "It was hard," he finally said. "Most people think the resource wars ended when the Federation made contact, but the scars run deep. I grew up in Detroit, in the ruins of what used to be called the Motor City. My father was a scrapper, collecting metal from the old factories to trade for food. My mother worked in the water reclamation plant until—" He trailed off, the memory still painful even years later. Until she died defending it from raiders, the dean finished gently. I read your application file. You were 14 when you organized the neighborhood children to help evacuate the elderly during the flood of 2157. Marcus nodded, surprised that such details had made it into his academy records. Someone had to do it. The adults were busy with the flood barriers and the evac shuttles couldn't reach everyone in time. A 14-year-old child taking responsibility for the lives of others in a crisis, Dean Vothari mused. Tell me, do you know how the other species in your class would have responded to such a situation? Marcus frowned, not sure where this was leading. No, not really. The Ethereals would have formed a consensus committee to debate the most elegant solution, the dean explained. The Aquarians would have sought guidance from their pod elders, who might take days to reach a decision through their collective consciousness. The Zephyrites would have calculated probabilities until they found the statistically optimal outcome. They paused at an observation deck that offered a spectacular view of the triple star system that powered the Academy. The light played across Dean Vothari's scales in mesmerizing patterns as she continued. None of them would have simply acted because action was needed. That is a uniquely human trait, Marcus. Your species doesn't just survive chaos, you thrive in it. You make decisions with incomplete information. Accept responsibility for outcomes you can't control, and somehow manage to succeed despite violating every principle of logical decision-making. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. You're saying we're reckless. I'm saying you're miraculous, the dean corrected. Do you know why Professor Veltar's consciousness was so badly damaged by contact with yours? Because I hurt him somehow? Because human minds are too crude? Dean Vothari's laugh was like silver bells in a gentle breeze. Oh, my dear student, human minds aren't crude. They're compressed. Every other species in the galaxy evolved under relatively stable conditions. Even our homeworlds were peaceful compared to Earth. We developed consciousness like crystal gardens, growing slowly in perfect conditions. She gestured toward the stars with one graceful arm. But Earth forged consciousness like a diamond is formed, under impossible pressure, constant threat, endless adaptation. What you call primitive survival instincts are actually the most sophisticated threat assessment and response systems in the known galaxy. They walked on, passing groups of alien students who still stared at Marcus with mixtures of fear and fascination. Word of the incident had spread quickly through the Academy's gossip networks. Professor Veltar made a critical error, the dean continued. He assumed that because human consciousness appears simple on the surface, it actually is simple. He was like someone trying to pet what they thought was a house cat, only to discover they'd approached a sleeping tiger. Marcus stopped walking. You're saying what happened to the professor wasn't an accident? I'm saying it was inevitable, Dean Vothari replied. Every species has defense mechanisms, Marcus. The Ethereals can phase out of reality when threatened. The Aquarians can merge their consciousness with their pods for protection. The Zephyrites can shift their temporal existence to avoid danger. And humans? Humans fight back. The dean's eyes seemed to glow with an inner light. Not with elegant solutions or carefully calculated responses. When a human consciousness is invaded, it doesn't retreat or hide or seek consensus. It identifies the threat and eliminates it with whatever tools are available. They had reached another medical facility, this one much smaller and clearly designed for human physiology. Through the transparent walls, Marcus could see other human students from the Academy's exchange program. They were all awake, sitting up in their beds and talking excitedly. Your fellow humans felt the psychic resonance when you defended yourself, Dean Vothari explained. It awakened something in all of them. The Academy's monitoring systems recorded unprecedented neural activity in every human on the station. Marcus stared at his classmates. Sarah Kim was levitating a medical tablet with what looked like pure concentration. David Okafor was manipulating light patterns with his bare hands. Maria Santos was having an animated conversation with a holographic representation of Professor Zelith, one of the Academy's most advanced AI instructors. "I don't understand," Marcus said. "Yesterday, none of us could even feel psionic energy. Now they're doing what humans have always done," the dean said. "Adapting, learning, overcoming. You see, Marcus, Professor Veltar was wrong about human consciousness being too crude for psionic manipulation. The truth is quite the opposite." She touched a control panel, and the room filled with holographic displays showing brain scans, energy readings, and complex mathematical models. "Human consciousness is too powerful for most psionic techniques. The meditative approaches we teach work for species with naturally calm, centered minds. But trying to make a human consciousness peaceful enough for traditional psionics is like trying to dam a river with tissue paper." Marcus studied the data, pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to fall into place. "So, when Professor Veltar forced the connection, he bypassed all the meditation requirements and showed you how to access psionic energy directly," the dean confirmed. "Of course, he also demonstrated exactly why forcing such contact with a human mind is extremely dangerous. Your consciousness didn't just access psionic energy, it weaponized it." The implications were staggering. Marcus thought about every time he'd been told humans were too primitive for advanced galactic society. Every subtle insult, every condescending explanation about human limitations, every reminder that Earth was considered barely worthy of Federation membership. "Dean Vothari," Marcus said slowly, "how many people know about this, about what human consciousness can really do?" The ancient Naga was quiet for a long moment, her serpentine form coiling as she considered her words. "Very few," she finally admitted. "The Federation Council has suspected since first contact, but they were content to let humanity believe they were inferior. It was safer that way." Safer for whom? For everyone else. The weight of that statement hung in the air between them. Marcus looked again at his fellow humans, who were unconsciously reshaping reality with nothing more than focused intention and emotional determination. No meditation, no years of training, no careful cultivation of inner peace. Just raw human will made manifest. "There's something else you need to know," Dean Vothari said, her voice taking on an urgent tone. "The incident with Professor Veltar has been reported to the Federation Council. There are those who will see this as confirmation of their fears about humanity." "What kind of fears?" "That your species is too dangerous to remain in the galactic community." The dean's words hit Marcus like a physical blow. "There are factions that believe humanity should be quarantined back to Earth, perhaps even managed more directly." Marcus felt the same surge of protective anger that had overwhelmed Professor Veltar, but this time he managed to control it. The lights in the corridor flickered briefly as his emotions spiked, and he realized he was unconsciously affecting the Academy's systems. "They want to cage us," he said, his voice deadly quiet. "Some do, yes, but others see opportunity." Dean Vothari moved closer, her ancient eyes holding depths of wisdom and calculation. "Marcus, what happened today wasn't an accident or an awakening. It was a test." The corridor around them seemed to hold its breath as the implications of her words sank in. Marcus realized that everything from his selection for the Academy to Professor Veltar's aggressive demonstration had been carefully orchestrated. "You knew this would happen," he whispered. "I hoped it would," the dean admitted. "Humanity needs allies in the galactic community, and allies need to understand what they're allying with. Today, you showed them. And if I had seriously injured the professor, if I had killed him," Dean Vothari's smile was sharp as a blade, "then we would have learned something different about humanity, wouldn't we? But you didn't. Despite being invaded, mocked, and violated, you showed exactly the restraint that proves humans can be trusted with power. Marcus looked again at his fellow students, who were unconsciously revolutionizing everything the galaxy thought it knew about consciousness and reality manipulation. The weight of responsibility for his entire species settled on his shoulders, but surprisingly, it didn't feel crushing. It felt right. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now," Dean Vothari said, "you learn to control what you've awakened, all of you, because there are forces in the galaxy that won't be content to simply quarantine humanity. Some will see your potential and want to exploit it. Others will see it as a threat that must be eliminated." The lights in the corridor pulsed in rhythm with Marcus's heartbeat as he processed this information. Somewhere in the academy, Professor Veltar was slowly recovering from his encounter with unfiltered human consciousness. Somewhere else, Federation officials were deciding whether humanity deserved to remain free. And here, in a medical facility designed to treat aliens who had no idea what they were dealing with, 12 human students were unconsciously rewriting the rules of what was possible in the universe. Marcus smiled grimly. If the galaxy wanted to test humanity, they were about to discover that humans had been testing themselves their entire evolutionary history, and they had never failed a survival test yet. 3 weeks after the incident with Professor Veltar, the Galactic Academy had become a very different place. The sterile, peaceful halls now hummed with an undercurrent of energy that made the monitoring systems constantly recalibrate their readings. Human students moved through the corridors with a new confidence, their presence subtly affecting everything around them in ways that the Academy's designers had never anticipated. Marcus stood in the center of the Academy's main assembly hall, a massive spherical chamber that could hold representatives from every species in the Federation. Today, it was packed to capacity. Beings who had traveled from the furthest reaches of the galaxy floated, perched, or stood on platforms arranged in concentric circles around the central speaking area. The air shimmered with translation fields and the exotic energies of dozens of different life forms. At the highest tier of the assembly sat the Federation Council, 12 beings representing the oldest and most powerful civilizations in the galaxy. Their forms were so advanced, so removed from physical matter, that most species could barely perceive them as more than shifting patterns of light and shadow. Dean Vothari had prepared Marcus for this moment, but seeing it in person was overwhelming. This was the equivalent of a planetary trial, where the fate of an entire species would be decided based on the actions of one individual. "Marcus Chen of Earth," the council speaker's voice resonated through every translation device simultaneously, creating a harmonic that seemed to vibrate through the very atoms of his body. "You stand before this assembly as representative of humanity, a species whose presence in our galactic community has become problematic." Marcus looked around at the gathered aliens. Some faces showed curiosity, others fear, still others barely concealed hostility. In the lower tiers, he could see his 11 fellow human students, each of them having grown tremendously in their abilities over the past 3 weeks. Sarah could now bend space-time with her thoughts. David could manipulate matter at the molecular level. And Maria had somehow learned to communicate directly with the Academy's quantum computing systems. But they weren't the only humans present. In a section specially shielded for their protection sat 12 Federation ambassadors from Earth, men and women who had been summoned for this hearing. Marcus could see the shock in their faces as they watched what their species' children had become. The incident with Professor Veltar has raised serious questions about humanity's compatibility with galactic civilization, the council speaker continued. "We have convened this assembly to determine whether humans represent an asset or a threat to the continued peace and stability of our Federation." A new figure materialized on one of the speaking platforms. Professor Veltar himself, his crystalline form still bearing hairline cracks from his encounter with Marcus's consciousness. He moved carefully, his usually brilliant luminescence dimmed but steady. "Honored Council," Professor Veltar began, his chiming voice carrying clearly through the chamber. "I must first acknowledge that my actions toward Student Chen were inappropriate and unprofessional. My attempt to forcibly demonstrate psionic techniques through neural invasion violated Academy protocols and basic ethical standards." A murmur ran through the assembly. Many had expected the professor to condemn humanity, not accept responsibility for the incident. "However," he continued, "what I discovered during that contact has profound implications for our understanding of consciousness itself. Humans do not lack psionic ability. They have evolved a form of it so compressed and powerful that our traditional detection methods cannot recognize it." The professor gestured, and holographic displays filled the air around him, showing brain scans and energy readings that made several species in the audience gasp in recognition. "Human consciousness operates at pressures and intensities that would destroy most known forms of life," Professor Veltar explained. "They have developed what can only be described as weaponized awareness, the ability to enforce their will upon reality through pure determination and emotional focus." One of the council members, a being of pure energy that appeared as shifting geometric patterns, pulsed with what Marcus had learned to recognize as the equivalent of raising a hand. Professor Veltar, the energy being communicated through harmonics that bypassed the translation system entirely, "Are you suggesting that humans represent a military threat to the Federation?" "Not a military threat," the professor replied. "An evolutionary one." The assembly hall erupted in sounds that Marcus's universal translator couldn't even attempt to render into human language. Shrieks, harmonics, subsonic rumbles, and electromagnetic pulses filled the air as hundreds of species tried to process the implications of that statement. Dean Vothari rose from her position in the Academy section, her ancient presence commanding immediate silence. "Professor Veltar speaks the truth, but only part of it. May I present evidence to the assembly?" The council speaker indicated consent, and suddenly the air filled with holographic recreations of the past 3 weeks. Marcus watched himself and his classmates training under Dean Vothari's guidance, learning to harness abilities that seemed to violate everything the galaxy understood about consciousness and energy manipulation. In one scene, David Okafor was shown rebuilding a damaged section of the Academy's hull by convincing the metal at a molecular level that it wanted to be whole again. In another, Sarah Kim demonstrated her ability to create stable wormholes simply by believing that space should work differently in specific locations. Maria Santos appeared in conversation with the Academy's master AI, not through any interface, but by somehow talking directly to its consciousness as if it were another person. "As you can see," Dean Vothari narrated, "human psionic abilities do not follow traditional patterns. They do not require meditation, careful training, or technological enhancement. They operate through what humans call willpower, the ability to impose desired outcomes upon reality through focused intention." A new voice cut through the chamber, harsh and mechanical. "This only proves how dangerous they are." Marcus turned to see a massive mechanical being on one of the upper platforms, its form bristling with weapons and sensors. This was Ambassador Krathak of the Machine Consciousness, a faction that viewed biological species as inherently chaotic and untrustworthy. "Observe their history." Krathak's voice boomed through speakers that made the chamber walls vibrate. "Endless warfare, environmental destruction, resource depletion. They cannot even manage their own planet, yet we propose to grant them abilities that could reshape reality itself?" More voices joined the condemnation, painting humanity as a violent, primitive species whose inclusion in the Federation had been a mistake from the beginning. Marcus felt the familiar surge of anger, but this time he was ready for it. He had spent 3 weeks learning to control his emotional responses, guided by Dean Vothari's patient instruction. "May I respond?" Marcus asked, his voice somehow carrying clearly through the chamber despite the lack of amplification. The council speaker consulted briefly with the other council members before responding. "The floor recognizes Marcus Chen of Earth." Marcus stepped forward into the center of the speaking area, acutely aware that the next few minutes would determine the fate of his entire species. Around him, hundreds of alien beings waited to hear what the primitive human had to say in his defense. "Ambassador Krathak is right about human history," Marcus began, his words causing surprised murmurs throughout the assembly. "We are a violent species. We have fought endless wars, destroyed our environment, and competed for resources with a brutality that most of you find incomprehensible." He paused, looking around at the gathered faces. "But has anyone here asked why we survived those conditions when other species would have gone extinct?" Marcus gestured, and to his own surprise, holographic images appeared in the air around him. Images drawn from Earth's history, but somehow manifested by his will alone. "Every species here evolved under relatively peaceful conditions," he continued. "Your homeworlds were gardens compared to Earth. You developed consciousness in safety, with time to contemplate and grow wise. You learned cooperation because cooperation was always possible." The images shifted, showing scenes from Earth's violent past. Wars, natural disasters, species fighting for survival in hostile environments. But Earth taught us something different. We learned that sometimes cooperation isn't enough. Sometimes you have to fight, not because you want to, but because the alternative is extinction. We learned to make impossible choices with incomplete information. We learned to sacrifice ourselves for others, not through moral philosophy, but through necessity. Marcus felt the attention of the entire assembly focused on him and realized that his emotions were somehow projecting through the chamber, allowing every being present to feel a shadow of what it meant to grow up in constant danger. "You call us primitive, and you're right. We are primitive, but being primitive isn't the same as being inferior." The images around Marcus shifted again, showing humanity's achievements: art, literature, scientific discoveries, acts of heroism and sacrifice. "We may not have elegant solutions or perfect wisdom, but we have something that 3 billion years of survival on a death world taught us." Marcus looked directly at the council members, his consciousness somehow touching theirs despite the vast gulf between human and transcendent awareness. "We never give up." The silence that followed was profound. Marcus could feel the shift in the assembly's mood, the recognition of something they hadn't considered before. Then Professor Veltar spoke again, his voice carrying new respect. "The student speaks truth. During our neural contact, I experienced human consciousness directly. It is not crude or primitive. It is concentrated. Like a star's core, it contains energies and pressures that exist nowhere else in the galaxy." Dean Vothari rose again, her ancient wisdom adding weight to her words. "The Federation has thrived for millennia through the careful balance of different strengths. The ethereals provide wisdom, the Aquarians offer empathy, the machine consciousness brings logic and analysis. Each species contributes what they do best." She gestured toward Marcus and his fellow humans. "Humanity's gift is not their psionic abilities, though those are remarkable. Their gift is their refusal to accept defeat. In 12,000 years of galactic civilization, we have never encountered a species that simply will not stop trying, no matter what the odds." One of the council members, a being so ancient that it existed as living crystal formations, spoke for the first time. Its voice was like continents shifting, deep and slow and patient. "What does humanity offer the Federation that we do not already possess?" Marcus felt the weight of the question and realized that this was the moment everything had been building toward. Not just his time at the Academy, but humanity's entire relationship with the galactic community. Hope, he said simply. The word seemed to hang in the air, somehow carrying more meaning than its simple syllables should have been able to convey. Every species here has evolved to accept limits, Marcus continued. You've learned wisdom and patience and cooperation, because those were the tools that allowed you to survive in peaceful environments. But sometimes the universe presents problems that can't be solved with wisdom or patience or cooperation. He thought about his mother, dying to protect the water plant, about his father, scrapping metal in the ruins to feed his family, about every human who had ever stood up against impossible odds simply because someone had to. When the universe says something is impossible, every other species accepts that judgment and finds ways to work within those limits. But humans? Marcus smiled, and his smile somehow carried the warmth of a sun that had burned for billions of years without dimming. Humans look at impossible and say, "Try us." The vote, when it came, was unanimous. Humanity would remain in the Federation, but more than that, they would be invited to join the Council's research initiatives, exploring regions of space and problems that other species had deemed too dangerous or impossible to handle. As the assembly dispersed and the various species began making their way back to their home systems, Marcus stood with his fellow humans and watched the stars wheel overhead. Tomorrow they would return to their studies, but everything had changed. Humanity was no longer the primitive species grudgingly admitted to galactic civilization. They were the ones you called when impossible wasn't good enough. Professor Veltar approached as the chamber emptied, his crystalline form moving with careful dignity. "Student Chen," he said, his voice carrying warmth that Marcus had never heard before. "I owe you an apology and a debt. My actions were inexcusable, and your response taught me more about the nature of consciousness than centuries of research." Marcus extended his hand in the human gesture of reconciliation. "We're good, Professor. Besides, if you hadn't pushed me, none of this would have happened." The professor gently touched Marcus's hand with one crystalline finger, and this time the contact was warm and respectful. "Perhaps," he said, "that was exactly what needed to happen." As they walked together toward the exit, Marcus realized that karma had indeed struck back, but not in the way anyone had expected. Professor Veltar's attempt to demonstrate human inferiority had instead revealed human potential. His casual cruelty had awakened something that would change the galaxy forever. And somewhere in the cosmic balance of actions and consequences, the universe had taken note of a species that refused to accept defeat. The galaxy would never be the same.